So I decided to take on the challenge. The challenge is to complete every Final Fantasy game. And by every, I mean every Final Fantasy game. This includes not just every mainline game, but also every spin-off game associated with the Final Fantasy franchise. I'm going to play the ones I've already played before, the ones I haven't played before, the good games, and also the bad ones. And I don't intend to just play them all, but play them in order of their release. And I've decided to call this series Rediscover Final Fantasy. And I think it's fitting. Sounds like something Nomura would come up with, right? Now, we'll talk a bit more about the specifics of this series later, but what I really want to tell you about is my experience with the game that started it all, Final Fantasy, and specifically the version that I played, which is the Pixel Remaster version. Oh, and can you guess what this means? Forump. By now, you've all heard the history lesson on the first Final Fantasy game. It was created out of desperation by Square Enix as a last-ditch effort before filing for bankruptcy, and supposedly, this is why they called it Final Fantasy. Except, I'm here to school you and tell you that that is actually wrong. I don't know who started this rumor, but the father of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi, has stated himself, and I mean, who would know better than him, that this isn't true. He just happened to like the name Final Fantasy. In fact, it was supposed to be named Fighting Fantasy, but then they changed it to Final Fantasy because of some trademark issue, or something like that. Anyway, it's called Final Fantasy because a guy making video games in his 20s liked the name. That's why.
ちなみになんですけれども、ファイナルファンタジーというネーミングの由来もちょっと伺ってもよろしいですか？名前の由来でちょっと。名前ですね。最初はね、これね、あまりかっこいい話じゃなくて、ファイティングファンタジーだったんですね。はい。ただドラゴンクエストが当時ドラクエって呼ばれて、略されてやっぱりこう世の中にもう一作目はこう定着しかけていたんで、やっぱ僕たちは略された時に。アルファベットにしたいねっていうのがあったんです。だから FF ありきなんです。はい、FF がもうじゃあもう最初からあって、でファイティングファンタジーで、ちょっとそれはいろいろ商標とかねいろいろあるじゃないですか。ちょっと無理だねってことで仕方なくファイナルファンタジー。ファイナルでいいんじゃねみたいな。割と軽い気持ちでファイナルが来たんですね。
Now, it's true that this is certainly the first game that Squaresoft, as it was known at the time, had a breakout success selling over 1 million copies globally. Their other games just weren't performing super well, and it's likely that if they never had some kind of breakout success game, that they might have eventually gone bankrupt. But the idea that it was all riding on Final Fantasy to be successful is simply not accurate. If Final Fantasy came out and just broke even with sales, Squaresoft likely still would have continued to make games, and who knows what their legacy would be today if that had happened, or whether they would have folded 5 years later and become a forgotten game company, or just pivoted to making other kinds of software instead of video games. Nobody would know the answer to that. All we know is that Final Fantasy became the golden goose of the company and remained so more than 35 years into the future. Now that I've cleared the air with that, let's get to what I think about Final Fantasy. But first, I should probably talk about my prior experience with Final Fantasy I. My first experience playing Final Fantasy was sometime around the early to mid-2000s, and I chose to play the version on PS1 that was part of the Final Fantasy Origins package, which contained both Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy II. When I first booted the game up, I remember being presented with two options for difficulty, easy mode and normal mode. I usually pick normal mode when I play games, so that's what I picked. Boy, was I in for a treat. I did not think that by picking normal mode, it was going to default to the kind of difficulty of playing the original on NES. So I basically got the experience of playing the original just with enhanced graphics, UI, audio, and apparently a lot of the bug fixes, some of which were apparently pretty bad, like certain weapons not being effective against the monsters they're supposed to be weak to, and buffs that don't even work. But otherwise, I was basically getting a one-to-one experience of the original game, and it was hell. Not only did I do a significant amount of grinding to get the latest weapons, armor, and spells, but if you didn't know, there were no Phoenix Downs in the original game, and no Ethers. And because the MP was so completely unbalanced, and the fact that I picked the Black Mage, who's basically useless because he never really had enough MP to use consistently throughout a dungeon and would keel over after getting hit like once, he turned into a damsel in distress who needed to be protected by just defending every fight and let the rest of the party carry the fights. And the White Mage wasn't much better. Now, if you don't know, the original Final Fantasy has a different MP system than many of the later Final Fantasies, as well as most RPGs today. Every magic spell is assigned a particular level of classification, 1 through 8. For example, the basic Cure spell is a level 1 magic spell, while Cure Raja is a level 7 spell, and your characters have MP for each level, and each magic spell consistently always costs just 1 MP for the level it's classified as. The problem is, as your character's base level goes up, you barely get any extra MP for the later magic levels, and so you'll be constricted to only being able to use the highest level Cure spell like once or twice. They'll give you plenty of MP for level 1 spells, but when your characters start to have 1000 HP and Cure only restores 50 HP at a time, having 30 MP will run dry really fast. So anyways, I continued playing the game until I got to around the Ice Cavern. I remember I was having so much difficulty even at around level 45, and then I realized that the max level was only 50, and because of that I quit. I eventually revisited the game sometime in the late 2000s and beat the game on the easy difficulty. Fast forward to 2023, and I was able to play the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster. So my expectations were that it was going to be much easier than what I played on the normal difficulty of the Final Fantasy Origins versions. So I created the same party setup I did when I first played the game, which is Warrior, Monk, White Mage, Black Mage. Should be a pretty balanced party, right? Nope. The Black Mage still is hardly useful. I essentially treated him the same way I did all those years ago when I played the Origins version. He just defended like almost every turn. Occasionally I would cast magic on foes that were resistant to physical attacks, but for the most part his most useful attribute was casting haste on both my warrior and monk during boss fights, which with the way the game's battle system works, it's kind of like doubling their attack power, which is really useful, except I could have just picked a red mage instead and probably could have done the same thing, except might have survived 1 or 2 attacks and also could kill some enemies with physical attacks on occasion. But overall, the game's difficulty is fairly well balanced in this Pixel Remaster. It's definitely trying to emulate the kind of experience the original game provided. The difficulty of the original game isn't about strategizing during boss fights. You do have to strategize a bit, but the strategy really comes in the form of resource management. The challenge of Final Fantasy I is to minimize the amount of turns in a fight, otherwise you'll sustain more damage which will require your party to heal itself, and if you heal too often, you'll run out of MP rather quickly, or you'll run out of healing items. This then requires you to leave the dungeon and rest up with a cottage, or go back to town and rest at the inn and possibly stock up on more items. Hopefully your ass doesn't get murdered on your way back, which, thankfully due to some quality of life improvements made in this Pixel Remaster, I didn't need to worry about that. In this particular version of the game, you can choose to turn encounters off entirely, which really came in handy a couple of times when I was starting to get low on MP during a dungeon. I told myself when I started that I wasn't going to use this feature because it's technically cheating, but when your ass is on the line and you really don't feel like dying and then having to redo the dungeon and shit, yeah, I took advantage of it. Only a couple of times though. As the game progressed, I actually felt it got a bit easier in that regard, and I started to have some deja vu from the time I actually finished it on easy mode on the PS1. At a certain point, you can get a healing staff, which, if you equip on your white mage, it will allow you to use it during battle to cast heal on the party, which is a restorative spell that only heals a small amount of HP. But the white mage is mainly useless at attacking, so you can basically just use it every turn and the small amount it heals will add up, keeping your party in shape for the most part. The huge benefit to doing this is that it doesn't cost MP, which is the main struggle you'll have when navigating dungeons, is the fear of running out of MP and not being able to heal your characters anymore. So it's like FOMO, but Forum? You can also, in this version, boost the amount of XP and gil you receive from battles, but I can safely say that I didn't take advantage of that, and I never really felt like I needed to. My characters were progressing fast enough, and I generally had a good amount of gil to buy most of the stuff I needed. In fact, by the time I got to the end, I had way more money than I could have ever possibly even needed. And another quality of life improvement was the addition of a map, and not just a map, but a map that shows you where the treasure chests are. This is a big deal, especially when a game has random encounters. There's nothing worse than checking a corridor that leads to a dead end just to find no treasure, and along the way you ran into several encounters, which leads to your characters getting damaged and then having to run back just to run into more encounters, which damages your characters even more, which then means that you have to spend MP healing them, which causes you to have anxiety because you have 4-room. This is why I used to buy strategy guides, because it showed you the layout of the dungeon with maps, and then you could just plan your route to avoid all the unnecessary dead ends with no treasure. It helps to alleviate 4-room. But now, they literally give you the map with all the treasure, so you don't need a stupid strategy guide anymore. It's great. Another great addition to this Pixel remaster is, of course, the music, and I'm glad to see that they also remastered the songs that were included in the PS1 version. If you didn't know, Nobuo Uematsu added boss music and a couple of other tracks in that version. Love the battle song in this game, but it would be a bit anticlimactic to fight Chaos with the standard battle track. And the music is extraordinarily well done. They were definitely recorded with live instruments, and they've never sounded better than this in my opinion. I'm definitely looking forward to playing more of these Pixel remasters just for this reason alone. So, how's the story in this game? Well, it's an NES game made in 1987, and it's the first Final Fantasy ever created, so, you know, it's pretty basic. There's barely any character dialogue at all. I mean, there aren't even much of characters in the game to have character dialogue, so you can't expect too much out of it. I was too lazy and didn't feel like writing a plot summary, so I asked ChatGPT to summarize the plot, and it did a better job than I would. Take it away, ChatGPT.
Final Fantasy follows the journey of 4 warriors, each representing one of the 4 elemental orbs: earth, fire, water, and wind, tasked with restoring light to the crystals and saving their world from darkness. They embark on a quest to defeat the evil forces led by the Dark Knight Garland and the 4 fiends, who have disrupted the balance of the world by shrouding it in darkness. The warriors traverse through different lands, facing various challenges, dungeons, and monsters while collecting key items and gaining new abilities. Along the way, they learn about the prophecy foretelling their role in restoring the crystal's light and saving the world from chaos. As the story progresses, they travel through time, ultimately confronting Garland, who turns out to be a pawn of the real antagonist, Chaos. After defeating Chaos in a battle transcending time, the warriors fulfill the prophecy, restoring light to the orbs and bringing peace back to their world. With their task completed, they return home, hailed as heroes who saved the world from destruction.
Thanks, ChatGPT. Great job. Nailed it. So the thing about these older games is that they don't really focus so much on narrative. The thing that makes older RPGs of this era special, in my opinion, is more about what I guess I would call discoverability. These games are more about walking into town, talking to all the NPCs, and using your own noggin to figure out where to go next based on all the information you've gathered. The world is kind of like a puzzle, and you have to piece together all the clues it's providing to figure out where to go next. It's something that as RPGs became more narrative focused and started adding waypoints on maps that tell you where to go, this sense of discoverability has been lost a bit. And while I can't say that modern games have evolved for the worse, there is something particularly engaging about this concept of discoverability. It's often very rewarding to discover where to go next because you figured it out. The developers didn't tell you. So, what do I think of Final Fantasy's sense of discoverability then? Well, it's alright. I mean, it's the first Final Fantasy. What's there to expect? The game provides enough clues with NPC dialogue to figure out 90% of it, but the one part that I ended up looking at a walkthrough online for was after waking the sleeping elf prince. Like, you get the magic key, and sure, I went back to all the places and got a bunch of chests, and the game makes it pretty clear that in Cornelia, when you pick up the chest that contains the nitro powder, that it's going to be an important asset since it plays the key item jingle. But I don't recall there being any clues as to where to use it. And it's not exactly obvious that this little piece of land could have even been blown up, let alone that that's what the nitro powder would be used to do. Basically, you would have to wander aimlessly until you eventually just end up finding the cave where there's a bunch of dwarves where one of them will use the nitro powder to blow up part of the land. The reason you would discover it eventually is because you're kind of stuck inside this inner ocean here, and there's really nowhere else you can go, I guess. Instead of the game actually providing legitimate clues as to what to do next, it feels a bit like I'm just using process of elimination. So I finished Final Fantasy 1. In fact, I didn't just finish it, I actually unlocked all of the trophies as well. It was pretty easy to do. Only took like an extra hour or two after finishing the game, so obviously the next game will be Final Fantasy 2. And so you might be wondering if there are any exceptions to the kind of games I'm going to cover. Basically, as long as it has a story to play through and isn't 100% multiplayer, and isn't some discontinued mobile game, the exception to the order rule will be the live service games, which include Final Fantasy 11 and 14, and maybe I'll play some of the mobile games like Brave Exvius, if they're not already discontinued by the time I get to them, which they already announced Dissidia Opera Omnia will end service on February 29th. So there's that. Before I even thought to do this, I actually started playing through the story of Final Fantasy XI about a year and a half ago. I only play one night a week for a few hours, so as not to get burned out on the game, and I recently finished Wings of the Goddess expansion and making my way through some of the shorter add-on content. Once I finish all of the main story content in Final Fantasy XI, I will probably be moving on to Final Fantasy XIV. Since I started 11 before doing these videos, I'll just make one video about the game, but I intend to make separate videos for each arc of the story, aka expansion, for Final Fantasy XIV. Well, that's it for this video. Stay tuned, and thanks for watching.